In the winter of 2001, a helicopter pilot named Brian Beck flew his aircraft to within 15 meters of a sheer cliff face at the bottom of the world. Not above it, not past it. Alongside it, close enough to see the individual ledges in the rock, close enough that the updrafts could have pushed him straight into the wall. He was doing this deliberately, pass after pass along 250 meters of vertical rock, flinging poison pellets into every crack and crevice he could reach. Because somewhere in those cracks were rats. And if even one of them survived what he was doing, the entire operation would have to start again from the beginning. Below those cliffs lay Campbell Island, 11,300 hectares of tussock and rock, 700 kilometers south of New Zealand, deep in the band of ocean that sailors call the Furious 50s, where the wind blows almost without stopping and the sun in midwinter barely clears the horizon. Brian Beck was one of 19 people on the island that month. Together, they had come to do something that had never been attempted anywhere on Earth: kill every single Norway rat on an island the size of a small city. The number they were dealing with was 200,000, the densest population of rats ever recorded anywhere on the planet. One rat for nearly every few square meters of the entire island. They had been there for 170 years. They had eaten this island almost to silence. The team had 120 tons of poisoned bait, 4 helicopters, barely decade-old GPS technology, and 1 month of flyable weather to make it work. The margin for error was this: 1 pregnant female. If a single pregnant rat survived in any gully, any ledge that Beck's helicopter couldn't quite reach, the rats would surge back within 2 years. 120 tons of poison. $2.6 million. 19 people isolated at the bottom of the world. All of it turned on, whether every last rat on 11,300 hectares was dead. They would not know for another 2 years, and what happened after the last rat died would become one of the most extraordinary wildlife recoveries ever documented, including the return of a bird that scientists said could not possibly be there. A bird unknown to science until 4 years earlier. A bird that came home before anyone came to bring it. I'm Graham Whitmore. This is the verified story of the largest rat eradication ever attempted on Earth. How New Zealand's Department of Conservation cleared 200,000 rats from an island 6 times bigger than any island ever cleared before. How a flightless duck declared extinct for a century became the thread the entire operation hung on, and what came back to Campbell Island once the rats were gone, including one thing nobody planned for, nobody predicted, and nobody could have engineered if they tried. Before we find out whether Beck's passes were enough before we get to those tracks in the mud and what the ornithologist said when he heard the description of them, you need to understand what this island was before the rats arrived. Because the scale of what was lost is the only way to understand the scale of what came back. Campbell Island is ancient. It broke away from the rest of the world tens of millions of years ago. And what evolved here in that isolation was something that sounds almost impossible. An island with not a single land mammal. Not one. No foxes, no weasels, nothing that hunted on the ground. The only predators were in the sky, and so the birds stopped being afraid of the ground. They nested directly on it, in the open, because there was no reason not to. The insects grew large, and generation by generation lost the ability to fly, because there was nothing to fly from. The megaherbs spread across the upper slopes. Giant wildflowers, with leaves nearly a meter across. Fields of lilac and yellow to every horizon. 21 species of seabird use this island as a breeding ground. 6 species of albatross nested on its cliffs, including one that breeds nowhere else on Earth. And among all of it lived a small, dark, flightless duck called the Campbell Island teal. It had evolved here across countless generations in complete safety and had let its ability to fly slip away entirely. It didn't need wings. There was nothing to fly from. It was a world built on the assumption that the ground was safe. That assumption was about to be shattered, and it would take nearly 2 centuries to restore it. On 4 January 1810, A sealing brig called the Perseverance reached Campbell Island's shore. Her captain, Frederick Hasselborough, was looking for fur seal colonies. He found them, named the island after his employer, a Sydney merchant named Robert Campbell, and sailed into the deep inlet that cut into the island's eastern coast. That inlet was named Perseverance Harbor, after his ship. 10 months later, Hasselborough drowned in that same harbor when his boat capsized in a squall. He had discovered the island and died on it within a year. The Perseverance came back 18 years later. In October 1828, she was wrecked on Campbell Island, the only ship of all the ships that ever visited that was lost there. And when she went down, the rats came ashore. 12 years was all it took. By 1840, when the first scientific expedition arrived on the ships Erebus and Terror, the same ships that would later vanish in the Arctic ice with the doomed Franklin expedition, the researchers came ashore and noticed something strange. There were almost no land birds on the island. They recorded what they saw, thinking they were describing Campbell Island's natural wildlife. They were describing what was left of it after 12 years of rats. What those rats did over the following 170 years is almost incomprehensible in its thoroughness. They ate eggs. They ate chicks. They ate insects and plant seeds. They were seen diving for mussels along the shore. Norway rats are strong swimmers and fierce competitors, and on Campbell they found a landscape that had never evolved a single defense against them. The pipit was driven from the main island entirely. The snipe vanished. The storm petrels, diving petrels, prions, their colonies shattered. And the Campbell teal, that flightless duck that had evolved across millions of years without fear, was simply gone. So completely gone that by the early 20th century, scientists listed it as extinct. Not endangered, extinct. The rat population cycled with the seasons. In lean months, 50,000. In good months, up to 100,000. The highest rat density ever recorded on any island on Earth. And this continued without interruption for 170 years. The rats weren't the only damage. From the late 1800s until 1931, a sheep farm operated on Campbell. About 7,000 sheep grazed the slopes, and the farmers brought cats. When the last leaseholder left in 1931 with nothing broken by the isolation, the climate, and collapsing wool prices, the island was eventually declared a nature reserve, and the long work of undoing the damage began. The sheep came first. Through the 1970s and 1980s, the Department of Conservation divided the island in sections and cleared every last animal. By 1991, not a single sheep remained. The vegetation responded almost immediately. Grasses returned. Megaherbs spread back across slopes they hadn't touched in decades. And then the cats began to die. Nobody planned this. DOC Ranger Derek Brown explained it. On short-cropped grass, a cat hunts easily. In tall, saturated thickets, in a climate where it rains more than 300 days a year, it cannot. The cats were wet and cold constantly. They stopped breeding. By the mid-1990 seconds, without a single one being trapped or killed, they were simply gone. The sheep were removed by people. The cats vanished on their own. The rats outlasted both. They remained in their hundreds of thousands across every hectare, right down to the last cliff ledge. To deal with them would require something the world had never done before, and doing it would only matter if there was something left alive to come home afterwards, which is what makes 12 November 1975 so important, because without what happened that day, clearing the rats would have saved an empty island. A wildlife service expedition led by Rodney Russ landed on Dent Island, a 23-hectare rock, 3 kilometers offshore, steep and cliff-sided, separated from Campbell by a stretch of cold southern ocean the rats had never crossed. As far as the record shows, no human being had ever stood on it. And what Russ found there stopped the team cold. The Campbell Island teal, alive, a tiny population, probably 30 to 50 birds on 23 hectares of bare rock, hanging on to existence by the most precarious thread imaginable. listed as extinct for nearly a century. Not gone at all, simply overlooked on a rock nobody had thought to visit. The teal hadn't been saved, it had been missed by the rats. One bad storm, one piece of driftwood, carrying a single rat across 3 kilometers of water. One accidental introduction, and the entire species was gone within a breeding season. Conservationists understood immediately. They could not leave the teal on Dent Island and hope. The species needed an insurance population in captivity on the mainland, and eventually, it needed its home back. Both depended on solving problems nobody had solved before. In 1984, 11 teal were captured from Dent Island and taken to the Pukaha Mount Bruce Wildlife Center on New Zealand's North Island. The problem was fundamental. Nobody had ever studied this duck in the wild. Nobody knew what it ate, what light conditions triggered breeding, what social dynamics it needed. The keepers had to guess. And for years, every guess was wrong. Not one egg was laid. By 1993, 9 years in, the entire future of the species, resting on what happened in those pens, the captive population had produced nothing. Then, in 1994, a wild-caught female named Daisy finally accepted a male named Donald. 2 ducklings hatched the first Campbell Island teal ever born in captivity, anywhere in the world. Once the keepers understood what Daisy needed, the birds began breeding year after year. The population climbed to 60 by 2000. But here is the detail that has to be said plainly. Daisy was the only wild origin female who ever laid eggs in captivity. Not one other female produced offspring. Every Campbell Island teal alive today, every bird in the captive program, every bird returned to the island, every bird counted in every recovery survey descends from one duck. The entire genetic future of the species passed through a single female named Daisy in a wildlife center on New Zealand's North Island in 1994. The genetic diversity of the species is still dangerously low as a result. One introduced disease could still devastate everything 30 years of work produced. By 1999, 24 captive-bred birds had been released onto predator-free Codfish Island as a staging population. They had an 88% survival rate. The birds were ready to go home. But home still had 200,000 rats in it. The plan the Department of Conservation assembled was audacious to the point of recklessness. The largest rat eradication ever previously attempted had covered roughly 2,000 hectares. Campbell Island was 11,000, 306 times bigger than anything that had ever worked. On an island where the weather could ground helicopters for weeks, 700 kilometers from the nearest port. Former DOC Ranger Lindsay Wilson said of it, "There was a huge amount of skepticism that it would work. Most experts consulted thought it was simply impossible. The weapon was brodifacoum, an anticoagulant poison pressed into cereal pellets and dyed green, because green does not attract birds. Helicopters fitted with specialized bait-spreading buckets, guided by GPS technology barely a decade old, would spread bait at 6 kilograms per hectare across every square meter of the island's terrain. Every gully, every bog, every cliff face, every ledge. Because one pregnant female in one unreached corner of this island was all it would take to collapse everything. Every decision was built around one principle. The poison does not know the difference between a rat and a bird. The drop was timed for the depths of subantarctic winter, when most seabird species were out on the open ocean. The birds most at risk from the toxin were temporarily removed from the island and held safely. Every flight track was logged by GPS each evening, and any gap was reflown the following morning. No gully left unbaited, no ledge skipped. The hardest flying fell to Brian Beck along cliffs, rising 250 meters sheer from the water, 15 to 20 meters from the rock face, making pass after pass to fling pellets into every crevice where rats sheltered. In the same airspace, southern royal albatrosses with wingspans exceeding 3 meters were circling and soaring. The pilots discovered that at higher speeds, the albatrosses misjudged the closing distance of an approaching helicopter. Every pilot flew deliberately slower, Across the entire month, not a single collision happened. When the team arrived, they braced to deal with two targets: rats and feral cats. The cats had been on the island since the farming era, but the surveys found none. The cats had died out sometime in the previous few years, their hunting made impossible by the same tall, wet vegetation that had grown back after the sheep were removed. One fewer enemy. The full operation focused on the rats alone. 3 months of flyable weather had been budgeted. The team needed 60 hours in the air. In an almost unsettling stroke of luck, the weather that winter cooperated. Everything was done in 1 month. And then some of the team began to worry. It had been too easy. They feared they had missed something, some gully, some ledge, somewhere on 11,300 hectares. They could not check sooner than 2 years. Any surviving rats needed 2 full breeding seasons to reach numbers that traps and dogs could detect. All they could do was leave and wait. In 2003, 6 DOC staff returned with a dog named Jack, trained to find rats by scent. They lived on the island for a month. 4,000 trap nights, peanut oil sticks, laid on every rat path. If any rat survived, the smell would draw it in and tooth marks would appear. They walked every shore, searched every building, covered every slope, and then, in the buildings of the old abandoned weather station, they found rat droppings. Everything stopped. If those droppings were fresh, then 120 tons of bait, $2.6 million, 2 years of waiting, and the largest rat eradication ever attempted had produced nothing. Every sample was collected and sent for analysis. Traps were set and left. Nobody touched them until the team had gone. The analysis came back. Every dropping contained rhodamine, the harmless pink dye loaded into the test bait, dropped in 1999. To confirm the bait reached every rat on the island. The droppings were nearly 4 years old. In the subantarctic cold, preserved so perfectly, they were indistinguishable from something left the previous day. Not one fresh trace anywhere on Campbell Island. Not one gnaw mark on the peanut oil sticks. Not one rat detected by Jack. The largest island ever cleared of rats, 6 times bigger than anything that had worked before. Complete. After 170 years, Campbell Island had no rats. The recovery began not at the top of the food chain, but at the very bottom. The weta came back, first large, flightless, cricket-like insects suppressed for 170 years by rats that ate them at every life stage. Within months of the verification, a returning ranger described what he found as an eruption. Weta everywhere, picked from fallen leaves beside the hut, shaken from the litter in the forks of bushes. Animals nearly invisible on this island for generations, suddenly present in numbers that felt almost surreal. The plants followed. Across slopes gnawed bare for 170 years, vegetation thickened. The megaherbs began spreading into ground they had been excluded from since the sealing ships arrived. And the birds came back. The pipit, confined to offshore islets for nearly 2 centuries, crossed to the main island and re-established itself. The first researchers to encounter these birds noted something that stayed with them. The pipits were not afraid. They approached, curious and unguarded. These were, in all probability, the first human beings those birds had ever seen. They had evolved on rocks we had never visited. We were not something they had any reason to fear. And then came the thing nobody had planned for. In November 1997, on only the 3rd ever landing on Jacquemart Island, a 19-hectare rock 1 kilometer south of Campbell, so sheer it cannot be climbed from the sea, 3 DOC specialists arrived with search dogs. They were looking for teal. The dogs found no teal. They found a snipe. A bird no scientist had ever seen before. A separate subspecies living in complete isolation on that 19-hectare rock for approximately 170 years for the entire duration of the rat occupation its existence. Unknown to science until 3 people and 3 dogs happened to land there. Scientists were clear about what bringing it home would require. Catch it, breed it in captivity, Prepare it carefully. Transport it. 10 years of work, perhaps 20. That was the plan. The snipe did not wait for the plan. In 2003, the same year Jack was walking the shores, researchers found tracks pressed into the mud along the water's edge. Bird tracks. Nobody had a camera ready. They drew them by hand and radioed the description to an ornithologist on the mainland. The answer came back. These tracks cannot be here. The bird that made them has never been recorded on this island. It had crossed 1 kilometer of open ocean on its own, with no human assistance, within 2 years of the rats being gone. By March 2005, a fully feathered chick was found on the shore. By January 2006, more than 20 adults, 5 chicks, and an active nest had been counted on the main island. Then, the teal came home. In September 2004, the first 50 captive-bred and codfish island-reared birds were loaded into containers and transported south a journey of nearly 3 days by sea. Examined, vaccinated, fed through tubes. When the team arrived and prepared to release them, they found a lone male teal already there. He had swum the 3 kilometers from Dent Island entirely on his own, sometime after the rats were declared gone, and was waiting when the first shipment arrived, as if the species had been standing at the door waiting for its family to come home. 55 more followed in 2005, 54 more in 2006. 159 birds returned across 3 years. In 2011, the Campbell Island teal was officially downlisted from critically endangered to endangered, the first improvement in its conservation status since assessment began. Today, the population is estimated at 500 to 1,000 birds and officially listed as increasing. I would be doing you a disservice if I let this land as a clean triumph, because it is not entirely that. Campbell Island did not go back to 1810. We don't know what it looked like then. The first scientists arrived after 12 years of rats, and the damage was already done. Some species lost in those first 12 years are simply gone. No offshore refuge, no captive program that can reach them. They passed the point of no return before anyone knew they existed. Not everything that survived has fully recovered. Seabird species like the gray petrel need decades of uninterrupted breeding to rebuild colonies. Penguin numbers depend on ocean conditions no eradication can touch. And the teal population, despite its growth, still carries the genetic shadow of 1994. Every living bird descends from Daisy. One introduced disease could still devastate everything that took 30 years to build. This was the least bad option available to people with one shot at an impossible problem. Not a clean solution. The honest version of the story holds all of that alongside the recovery. Both are true at once. But there is one detail I keep returning to. In January 2010, scientists formally named the snipe subspecies discovered on Jacquemart in 1997. The bird nobody knew existed until 4 years before the eradication. The bird that came home across the water before anyone came to carry it. They gave it the scientific name Coenocorypha aucklandica perseverance. They called it Perseverance, after the brig, after the sealing ship that arrived on 4 January 1810 and put Campbell Island on the map. After the same ship that returned in 1828 ran aground and brought the rats ashore. After the ship whose wreck caused the 170 years of silence that the snipe spent in exile on an inaccessible rock 1 kilometer away. The ship that wrecked the island gave its name to the bird that survived the wreck. And on 4 January 2010, exactly 200 years to the day, after the Perseverance first reached Campbell Island shore, a grown snipe chick was photographed by the wooden walkway near the old research station. It had never been caught, never bred in captivity, never moved by anyone. It was simply there, on the island where its ancestors lived before the rats came ashore from the ship whose name it now carries. Step back and look at the whole shape of it. 4 January 1810, a sealing brig arrives. October 1828, the same ship wrecks and the rats come ashore. 170 years of destruction. 1975, a handful of birds listed as extinct for a century. alive on a 23-hectare rock no human had ever visited. 1984, 11 birds in a wildlife center on the North Island, 9 years of failure. One duck named Daisy, 2 ducklings. July 2001, 19 people and 4 helicopters drop 120 tons of poison in 1 month at the bottom of the world. 2 years of silence. Rat droppings that turned out to be 4 years old. Tracks in the mud that an ornithologist said could not be there. A bird that crossed an ocean before anyone came to help it. A species named after the ship that destroyed its world. What came back to Campbell Island was not the past. We cannot give it the past back. The scientists who arrived in 1840 were already too late to see it. What came back is something that had been waiting all along, pressed to the very edges of survival on the most inaccessible rocks. A flightless duck on 23 hectares, a snipe on 19 hectares, a pipit on a handful of offshore stones, waiting for the one thing blocking its return to be removed. We did not restore Campbell Island. We removed 200,000 rats. And then the island remembered what it was. The deepest lesson here may be the same one that keeps appearing in recovery stories all over the world, and that we keep finding difficult to fully believe, that the capacity for recovery is almost always still there, compressed and waiting, long after we have given up on it. That extinction is not always final. That a species reduced to 30 birds on a barren rock to the genetic line of a single female named Daisy can still find its way home if someone is willing to do the patient, difficult, unglamorous work of clearing the damage away. Not building something new, not designing a recovery, just removing the one thing standing in the way, and then getting out of the way. If this story changed what you thought extinction means, or what recovery is actually capable of, let me know in the comments. New Zealand has announced Predator-Free 2050, the goal of eliminating every rat, stoat, and possum from the entire mainland by 2050. Campbell Island was 11,300 hectares and took 19 people 1 month. The New Zealand mainland is 26 million hectares. Tell me whether you think that plan is the most ambitious conservation bet ever made or something that might actually work. If this gave you something to think about, share it with someone who'd appreciate it. Subscribe, because there are more of these verified comeback stories than you would ever guess, and I have plenty more to tell you. I'm Graham Whitmore, and I will see you in the next video.